2 hours ago, I walked out of my mother-in-law's kitchen after overhearing a conversation that shattered every assumption I'd made about my relationship with my wife's family. And what I did next in their living room left everyone speechless in ways I never thought possible. I'm 32 years old, and for the past 8 years I've been bending over backward to help my in-laws with everything from home repairs to financial emergencies, believing that my efforts were building bridges and earning their respect. But 5 minutes of accidentally eavesdropping revealed that they've been mocking my generosity behind my back while treating me like their personal ATM and handyman. My name is Owen, and I've been married to my wife Gabrielle for 6 years, together for 8. And from the very beginning, I wanted nothing more than to be accepted by her family as someone worthy of their daughter's love. Gabrielle's parents, Lawrence and Vivian, always seemed polite enough to my face, thanking me for help with various projects and crises. But there was something in their demeanor that made me feel like I was constantly auditioning for approval that never quite came. When Gabrielle and I first started dating, I was working as an electrician while finishing my business degree part-time, and her family made it clear through subtle comments and loaded silences that they'd hoped she'd end up with someone more established, someone with a cleaner job and clearer prospects for financial success. Lawrence worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, and Vivian had been a stay-at-home mom who did volunteer work at their church. And they moved in circles where professional credentials and social status mattered more than work ethic or character. But I was determined to prove myself worthy of their daughter, so whenever they needed help I volunteered immediately and enthusiastically. When their kitchen faucet started leaking, I spent my weekend replanting their entire sprinkler system. When their basement flooded during a storm, I took vacation days to help them clean up and repair the damage. When Lawrence's company downsized and he was laid off for 6 months, I quietly helped cover their mortgage payments without making a big deal about it or expecting public acknowledgement. Over the years, the requests for help became more frequent and more extensive. I rewired their entire house when they decided to renovate, spending 3 weekends crawling through their attic and basement to bring their electrical system up to code. I built them a deck, installed new windows, repaired their roof after hail damage, and handled dozens of smaller maintenance issues that Lawrence claimed he was too busy or too unfamiliar with tools to tackle himself. The financial help was even more significant, though I tried to keep it as discreet as possible to avoid making anyone feel uncomfortable. When Vivian's mother needed expensive medical care that insurance didn't cover, I contributed several $1,000s toward her treatment while letting Lawrence take credit for handling the family emergency. When their air conditioning system died in the middle of summer, I bought them a new unit and had it installed while they were visiting Gabrielle's sister, then told them it was a surprise gift from both Gabrielle and me. I genuinely enjoyed helping them and felt good about building relationships through service and generosity. Gabrielle was always grateful for my efforts and told me how much her parents appreciated everything I did for them, how impressed they were with my skills and work ethic, how lucky they felt to have such a capable and caring son-in-law. I believed that my consistent willingness to help was slowly but surely earning their respect and affection, that I was proving myself worthy of being part of their family. But there were signs I should have paid more attention to, moments when their gratitude felt perfunctory rather than genuine, times when they seemed to take my help for granted rather than appreciating it as the gift I intended it to be. They never reciprocated in any meaningful way, never offered to help Gabrielle and me with our own projects or challenges, never seemed curious about my life or interests beyond what services I could provide for them. The breaking point came today during what was supposed to be a routine family dinner at their house. Gabrielle and I had arrived early because I promised to look at their garbage disposal, which had been making strange noises for the past week. I'd fixed the problem in about 20 minutes and was washing my hands in their kitchen sink when I heard Lawrence and Vivian talking in the adjacent dining room, their voices carrying clearly through the thin wall between the rooms. They were discussing me with Gabrielle's sister Monica and her husband Brett, who'd apparently arrived while I was working under the sink. What I heard made my blood run cold and my hands shake as I realized they had no idea I was within earshot of their conversation. Lawrence was complaining about how I always insisted on fixing things myself instead of hiring professionals, how my DIY approach probably decreased the value of their home rather than improving it. Vivian chimed in with comments about how eager I was to please, how desperate I seemed for their approval, how she sometimes felt embarrassed by my obvious attempts to buy my way into their good graces through constant helpfulness. Monica laughed and said something about how convenient it must be to have a son-in-law who was basically free labor, someone so insecure about his place in the family that he'd do anything to prove himself worthy of their acceptance. Brett added that it was almost sad how hard I tried. How I reminded him of a puppy desperate for attention and validation from people who clearly considered themselves above his social class. But the comment that shattered me completely came from Vivian, who said in a tone of amused condescension that she supposed they should be grateful for my eagerness to help. Since someone with my background and education wasn't likely to contribute to the family in any other meaningful way. She said that at least my manual labor skills made me useful, even if I'd never be the kind of son-in-law they'd actually wanted for Gabrielle. I stood in that kitchen feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach, realizing that 8 years of effort and generosity had earned me nothing but contempt disguised as tolerance. They didn't see me as family or even as someone deserving of basic respect. They saw me as hired help who was too stupid to charge for his services, someone they could use for his skills while mocking his character and background in private. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of slinking away quietly or confronting them privately about what I'd overheard, I walked into their dining room with a calm smile and asked if I could share something with everyone before we started dinner. The room went quiet as 5 faces turned toward me, none of them realizing that I'd heard every word of their conversation about my character, my motivations, and my place in their family hierarchy. What I said next left them all speechless, but not because they were impressed by my eloquence or moved by my emotions. They were speechless because I'd finally stopped playing the role of the grateful son-in-law who was honored to serve, and started speaking the truth about what their acceptance had actually cost me over the years. The silence in that dining room felt thick and dangerous as 5 pairs of eyes stared at me, none of them quite sure what to expect, but all of them sensing that something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic. I looked around the table at these people I'd been trying so hard to impress for 8 years, at the faces that had smiled politely while accepting my help and then mocked my efforts the moment I left the room, and felt a calm clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I started by thanking them for the opportunity to overhear their real opinions about me, their honest assessment of my character and my place in their family. Lawrence immediately started to protest, claiming they hadn't been talking about anything important, but I held up my hand and asked him to let me finish before he tried to explain away what I'd heard through their kitchen wall. I told them that I'd spent the better part of a decade believing that service and generosity would eventually earn their respect, that consistent helpfulness would prove I was worthy of being Gabrielle's husband and their son-in-law. I'd rewired their house, built their deck, covered their mortgage payments, paid for their emergencies, and handled countless repairs and maintenance projects, all while telling myself that I was building relationships and demonstrating my value to their family. But listening to their conversation had taught me something valuable about the difference between respect and exploitation, between family bonds and convenient arrangements. They didn't see me as someone who chose to help them out of love and generosity. They saw me as someone who helped them because I was too insecure and desperate for approval to recognize when I was being used. Vivian tried to interrupt, saying that I'd misunderstood what they were discussing, that I was taking casual conversation out of context and making it into something more serious than it actually was. But I'd heard her tone, heard the amusement in her voice as she discussed my attempts to buy acceptance through usefulness. Heard her explain to Monica and Brett that someone with my background couldn't contribute to their family in any meaningful way beyond manual labor. I pulled out my phone and showed them a document I'd been keeping for tax purposes, a detailed record of every financial contribution I'd made to their household over the past 8 years. The list included the mortgage payments during Lawrence's unemployment, the medical bills for Vivian's mother, the new air conditioning system, the materials for various home improvement projects, and dozens of smaller expenses I'd covered without expecting repayment or recognition. The total amount was $73,000, not including the value of my labor for projects that would have cost them tens of thousands more if they'd hired professional contractors. I told them that this documentation wasn't something I'd created to hold over their heads or use as leverage in family conflicts. It was simply a record I'd maintained for my own financial planning. Proof of how much of my income had been devoted to supporting their lifestyle and solving their problems. Lawrence's face went pale as he processed the scope of my contributions, finally understanding that his free handyman had actually been subsidizing their family's financial stability for years. Monica looked uncomfortable, probably realizing that her comments about free labor had been more accurate than she'd intended. Brett seemed stunned that the puppy-like son-in-law they'd been mocking had actually been the primary reason his in-laws could afford their current lifestyle. But I wasn't finished. I told them that the money and labor weren't what bothered me most about overhearing their conversation. It was the realization that they'd never seen me as a person worthy of basic respect or honest communication. They'd accepted my help while privately mocking my motivations, had benefited from my generosity while discussing my character like I was some kind of social charity case they were forced to tolerate for Gabrielle's sake. I said that I'd spent 8 years trying to prove myself to people who had already decided I wasn't good enough for their daughter, people who would apparently never see me as anything more than convenient labor with low self-esteem. Their acceptance had been conditional from the beginning, dependent on my willingness to provide services they needed while never expecting to be treated as an equal member of their family. Vivian finally found her voice and started explaining that they'd always appreciated my help, that they'd never meant to make me feel unvalued or disrespected. That family conversations sometimes included casual comments that didn't reflect people's true feelings. She said that I was overreacting to what had essentially been a private discussion about family dynamics, that I shouldn't take everything so personally when people were just talking casually among themselves. Her response was exactly what I'd expected: deflection, minimization, and an attempt to make me feel guilty for being hurt by their honest opinions about my character and worth. She was asking me to pretend that overhearing their conversation had been a misunderstanding rather than a revelation, to continue playing the role of the grateful son-in-law who was honored to serve regardless of how they actually felt about him. That's when I told them about the decision I'd made while standing in their kitchen, listening to them mock 8 years of effort and generosity. I said that I was done providing free labor and financial support to people who saw my helpfulness as evidence of desperation rather than expressions of love and family loyalty. I was done trying to earn respect from people who had apparently decided that someone with my background and education couldn't contribute meaningfully to their family beyond manual labor and emergency funding. I explained that going forward, they could hire professionals for their home maintenance and repairs, could handle their own financial emergencies, could figure out their own solutions to problems that had previously been my responsibility to solve. I said that I'd be happy to maintain polite relationships with them for Gabrielle's sake, but that I was finished auditioning for acceptance that was apparently never going to be offered regardless of how much I contributed to their well-being. The room stayed silent for several long moments as everyone processed what I'd said and what it meant for future family dynamics. Lawrence looked like he was trying to calculate how much it would cost to hire contractors for projects he'd been planning to ask me to handle. Vivian seemed shocked that her compliant son-in-law was actually capable of setting boundaries and refusing future requests for help. Monica and Brett exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering their casual mockery of someone who'd apparently been more financially significant to the family than they'd realized. The puppy they'd been making fun of had just revealed that he'd been funding a substantial portion of his in-laws' lifestyle while they'd been entertaining themselves by discussing his supposed desperation for approval. I told them that I hoped they'd enjoyed their conversation about my character and motivations, because it had been incredibly educational for me as well. Then I walked out of their dining room in their house, knowing that I'd never again waste my time or money trying to prove myself worthy of acceptance from people who had never intended to accept me as an equal. The drive home with Gabrielle was one of the most difficult conversations of our marriage, filled with long silences and careful words as we both tried to process what had just happened and what it meant for our relationship going forward. Gabrielle had been upstairs when the confrontation occurred, had come down to find her family sitting in stunned silence around their dining room table while I gathered my tools and prepared to leave their house for what might be the last time. She'd heard enough of my speech to understand the basic situation, that I'd overheard her family's private conversation about me, that I'd been hurt by their comments, that I'd decided to stop helping them with projects and financial support. But she hadn't heard the specific details of what they'd said about my character and background, hadn't witnessed the casual cruelty with which they'd discussed 8 years of my efforts to earn their acceptance and respect. When I explained what I'd overheard in their kitchen, Gabrielle's reaction surprised me. Instead of immediately defending her family or trying to minimize the impact of their comments, she went very quiet and asked me to repeat exactly what each person had said about me, my motivations, and my place in their family. As I recounted their conversation word for word, I watched her face change from confusion to embarrassment to something that looked like recognition. She told me that she'd always sensed some tension between me and her family, had noticed that their gratitude for my help sometimes felt forced or perfunctory, but that she'd attributed those dynamics to normal adjustment issues between in-laws with different backgrounds and communication styles. She'd never imagined that they were actually mocking my efforts behind my back or discussing my character with such casual contempt. But as we talked more about family dynamics over the years, Gabrielle started remembering conversations and comments that took on new meaning in light of what I'd overheard. She recalled times when her mother had made subtle criticisms about my eagerness to help, moments when her father had seemed almost annoyed by my willingness to handle projects he claimed to be too busy for. Occasions when Monica had made jokes about my dedication to family service that had seemed harmless at the time. Gabrielle apologized for not recognizing how her family had been treating me, for not standing up more forcefully when they made comments about my background or education, for allowing their subtle disrespect to continue unchallenged because she'd hoped it would eventually resolve itself through time and familiarity. She said she felt guilty about encouraging me to maintain relationships with people who apparently saw my efforts as evidence of insecurity rather than expressions of love. The hardest part of our conversation was discussing what my decision meant for our marriage and our future family relationships. Gabrielle understood why I couldn't continue providing free labor and financial support to people who mocked my generosity. But she was worried about the long-term consequences of cutting off help to her parents who had become dependent on my contributions to maintain their lifestyle. I told her that I wasn't trying to punish her family or create permanent estrangement, but that I needed to protect myself from people who had proven they didn't respect me as a person regardless of how much I contributed to their well-being. I said that I was willing to maintain polite relationships for her sake, but that I couldn't continue investing my time, energy, and money in people who saw my helpfulness as a character flaw rather than a gift. Over the next few days, the fallout from my confrontation became clear as various family members reached out to Gabrielle to share their perspectives on what had happened and what they thought should happen next. Lawrence called to explain that their conversation had been taken out of context, that they'd never meant to hurt my feelings, that they hoped we could work through this misunderstanding without permanent damage to family relationships. Vivian sent a long text message apologizing for any comments that had made me feel unappreciated, saying that she'd always been grateful for my help even if she didn't always express it appropriately. She asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss the situation privately, to clear the air about any miscommunications that had led to hurt feelings and damaged relationships. Monica called Gabrielle to explain that she'd never intended her comments to be hurtful, that she'd been making casual observations about family dynamics rather than serious criticisms of my character or worth. She said that everyone was upset about the conflict and wanted to find ways to repair the damage that had been done through careless words and misunderstandings. But none of these apologies acknowledged the fundamental truth I'd discovered through overhearing their conversation, that they'd been accepting my help while privately mocking my motivations. That they'd seen my generosity as evidence of desperation rather than expressions of family loyalty. That they'd never actually respected me as an equal member of their family regardless of how much I contributed to their lives. Their responses focused on minimizing the impact of their comments rather than acknowledging the patterns of disrespect that had apparently been present for years. They wanted to treat this as a communication problem that could be solved through explanation and clarification, rather than recognizing it as a revelation about their true feelings toward me and my place in their family. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Lawrence called me directly to discuss a plumbing emergency at their house, a burst pipe in their basement that was causing flooding and damage. He explained that the situation needed immediate attention, that they'd called several contractors but couldn't get anyone to come out until the following week, that they really needed my help to prevent further damage to their home. His tone was different from previous requests for help, more formal and careful, like someone asking a favor from an acquaintance rather than assuming automatic assistance from family. He offered to pay me for my time and expertise, acknowledging that he understood our relationship had changed and that he couldn't simply expect free labor anymore. I told him that I appreciated his offer of payment, but that I was no longer available for emergency repairs or home maintenance projects regardless of compensation. I suggested that he contact a 24-hour emergency plumbing service, which would cost more than my free labor but would provide professional results with warranties and insurance coverage. The conversation was polite but distant, marking the end of 8 years of automatic helpfulness and beginning of whatever our new relationship would become. Lawrence seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't willing to help even with payment offered, apparently not understanding that the issue wasn't about money but about respect and the recognition that some relationships can't be repaired once their foundation of mutual regard has been exposed as illusory. That evening, Gabrielle told me that her parents' basement had flooded extensively before emergency contractors could arrive, causing thousands of dollars in damage that insurance might not cover. She said her father was stressed about the repair costs and timing, that her mother was upset about losing stored family items to water damage, that everyone was beginning to understand the practical consequences of no longer having access to my skills and willingness to help. I felt sorry for their situation but not guilty about my decision to establish boundaries with people who had proven they didn't value me as a person. Some relationships are transactional from the beginning, and pretending otherwise only leads to disappointment and exploitation. I learned the difference between being appreciated and being used, and I wasn't interested in returning to a dynamic that had never been as mutual or respectful as I'd believed. 3 months have passed since I overheard that conversation and confronted my in-laws about 8 years of hidden contempt, and the changes in our family dynamics have been both liberating and complicated in ways I didn't fully anticipate. The most immediate difference has been financial. Without the constant drain of covering their emergencies and projects, Gabrielle and I have been able to save money, plan for our own future, and make decisions based on our priorities rather than their needs. We've used some of the money I would have spent on their latest crisis to take a vacation we've been postponing for years. A week in Colorado that felt like the first time in our marriage when I wasn't mentally calculating how much of our income might be needed to solve someone else's problems. Being away from the subtle pressure of their expectations and requests gave me space to remember who I was before I'd started defining myself through their approval and my usefulness to their family. The vacation also gave Gabrielle and me time to talk honestly about patterns in our relationship that we'd both been avoiding, ways that her family's treatment of me had affected our marriage even when we hadn't recognized it at the time. She admitted that she'd sometimes felt caught between defending me and keeping peace with her parents, that she'd occasionally minimized my concerns about their behavior because addressing them would have required confronting uncomfortable truths about her family's character. Gabrielle has started setting her own boundaries with her parents, declining their subtle requests for her to ask me about helping with projects, refusing to relay their hints about financial emergencies that might benefit from my assistance. She's told them directly that our marriage comes first, that she won't participate in attempts to manipulate me back into my previous role as their unpaid contractor and emergency fund. Her parents have struggled to adjust to these new dynamics, apparently not realizing how much their lifestyle had depended on my contributions until those contributions stopped. Lawrence has had to hire contractors for repairs that would have been free through me, discovering that professional service costs significantly more than the gratitude and home-cooked meals he'd been offering in exchange for my labor. Vivian has been dealing with the social embarrassment of explaining to friends and extended family why their capable son-in-law is no longer available for projects and emergencies. Apparently having bragged over the years about having such a helpful family member without considering how those boasts would sound once the help disappeared. The most challenging aspect of our new situation has been navigating family gatherings and holidays, events where the absence of my previous helpfulness creates awkward silences and unmet expectations. Their house shows signs of deferred maintenance that I would have handled automatically, a squeaky door that annoys everyone, a loose railing that should be fixed for safety. Small problems that accumulate into larger frustrations when there's no one willing to address them immediately. During our last family dinner, I watched Lauren struggle with a malfunctioning garage door opener, clearly hoping I'd offer to diagnose and repair the problem as I would have done automatically in the past. Instead, I finished my meal and participated in conversation while he dealt with the inconvenience alone, experiencing firsthand what it feels like when family members don't automatically volunteer to solve each other's problems. The tension was obvious but unspoken, with everyone carefully avoiding any mention of household issues or maintenance needs that might sound like requests for help. Conversations felt stilted and formal, lacking the easy familiarity that had existed when I'd been actively trying to prove my worth through service and availability. But I've also discovered something unexpected in this new dynamic, without the pressure of constantly performing helpfulness. I've been able to develop more genuine relationships with some extended family members who appreciate me for qualities beyond my usefulness. Gabrielle's cousin Peter, who'd always seemed polite but distant, has started calling occasionally just to talk, apparently having more respect for someone who sets boundaries than for someone who accepts being taken advantage of indefinitely. Even Monica has reached out a few times, not to request help but to apologize more genuinely for her comments during that overheard conversation. She's admitted that she'd been thoughtless and cruel, that she'd participated in mocking my efforts without considering how hard I'd been working to build relationships with her family. Her apologies feel more sincere than her parents' attempts at damage control, suggesting that some people are capable of growth when confronted with the consequences of their behavior. The biggest surprise has been how much happier I feel without the constant background stress of managing other people's problems and expectations. For 8 years, I've been carrying the weight of their approval, measuring my worth through their satisfaction with my contributions, defining my identity through my usefulness to people who apparently never intended to value me as an equal. Now I wake up thinking about my own goals and priorities, make decisions based on what's best for Gabrielle and me rather than what might impress her parents. Spend my energy on relationships that are genuinely reciprocal rather than performatively generous. I've remembered what it feels like to be appreciated for who I am rather than what I can provide. Gabrielle says I seem more confident and relaxed, less anxious about family interactions and more focused on building our life together. She's right. I'm no longer auditioning for acceptance from people who never intended to accept me, no longer trying to prove myself worthy of respect from people who had decided my worth based on their prejudices about my background and education. 6 months ago, I would have seen cutting ties with my in-laws as a failure, evidence that I wasn't strong enough or generous enough to overcome their initial reservations about me. Now I understand that some people's acceptance isn't worth earning, that relationships based on exploitation aren't relationships worth maintaining, that respect that has to be purchased isn't respect at all. Lawrence and Vivian may never understand why their free handyman decided to start charging for his services, why their helpful son-in-law chose self-respect over family harmony. But I finally understand the difference between being loved and being used, between building relationships and funding performances, between family loyalty and enabling disrespect. Sometimes the most important conversation you'll ever have is one you were never supposed to hear, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is stop trying to earn approval from people who were never planning to give it. I'm done being their convenient solution to problems they should solve themselves, and I've never been happier to be considered inconvenient by people whose convenience was costing me my dignity. The best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting free. And after 8 years of bondage disguised as family service, freedom feels exactly like walking away from people who mistake your generosity for desperation and confuse your love with weakness.